What if the most explosive part of Meghan Markle's Highgrove disaster didn't actually happen inside Highgrove at all, but after she walked away from those tightly controlled palace doors? Because now comes the twist nobody inside the royal machine supposedly wanted becoming part of the conversation. After Meghan allegedly realized that the private meeting with King Charles had delivered none of the royal breakthrough she had hoped for, Tom Bower's latest claim is being interpreted in one particularly sensational direction that Meghan may have tried to find another route back to. Charles, one that did not depend on the very palace officials, apparently determined to keep every conversation, every request, and every possible reconciliation under strict control. And if that sounds dramatic, just remember what supposedly happened first. Meghan and Harry arrived expecting a deeply meaningful family encounter, yet what they allegedly received was something closer to a carefully contained royal audience, limited time, no glamorous photographs, no triumphant palace announcement, no public image of King Charles embracing Archie and Lilibet, and absolutely no obvious signal that the Sussexes were suddenly being welcomed back into the royal fold. The meeting happened, but the victory lap never came. And that is precisely where this alleged new chapter becomes so fascinating. Because imagine walking away from Highgrove knowing the official route had effectively produced nothing you could publicly use. According to the narrative surrounding that encounter, Charles had supposedly separated private family contact from official royal status with surgical precision. Meghan could meet the grandfather of her children, but that did not automatically mean access to the king as an institution, and those are two completely different things. The distinction sounds technical until you understand how devastating it could be for somebody hoping that one emotional reunion might reopen a much larger door. Because palace officials are not merely assistants arranging tea and checking diaries, they are the protective machinery surrounding the sovereign, filtering requests, controlling schedules, documenting communications, and making certain that private emotion does not suddenly become institutional policy. So if Meghan believed those officials were the wall standing between herself and another conversation with Charles, what would happen if she decided the only way through that wall was to go around it? That is where the gossip gets absolutely combustible. The speculative version now being whispered around this story is that Meghan, frustrated by how tightly managed Highgrove had allegedly been, explored whether a more personal channel could reach Charles without every word being processed through senior courtiers first. Not some dramatic midnight intrusion into a palace. Not Meghan physically sneaking past security. The reality is potentially far more subtle and therefore far more interesting. An alleged attempt to use personal relationships, private intermediaries, family connections, or an informal message that might reach Charles as a father before palace advisors could treat it as a request to the king. There is no verified evidence establishing that such an attempt occurred, but as a continuation of the Highgrove drama, the possibility raises an explosive question. If the official machinery was saying this far and no further, was Meghan prepared to test whether Charles himself might say something different? Because look at what the original Highgrove story claims Meghan had just experienced. Queen Camilla was allegedly present during the meeting, something Bower's narrative interprets as enormously significant, because her presence meant there was another trusted royal figure listening to what was being discussed. The entire atmosphere was supposedly restrained, monitored, and almost impossible to reinterpret afterward. No private conversation that could later become a battle of competing recollections. No photograph that could be transformed into a global reconciliation headline. No open-ended afternoon where grievances could be dragged out until somebody finally surrendered. Instead, the alleged message was brutally simple. Family contact might exist, but royal access remained controlled. And that is why any attempt to bypass officials would have been viewed as far more than an innocent follow-up. Inside palace culture, access itself is power. Who gets through, who receives an answer, whose message reaches the sovereign directly, and whose request dies quietly inside an office can determine the entire meaning of a relationship. Meghan allegedly discovering that the Highgrove meeting had changed none of those rules would have created exactly the frustration that fuels this new controversy. Perhaps, in this speculative scenario, she believed the courtiers were being more rigid than Charles personally wanted. Perhaps she believed that if she could communicate with him without layers of advisors surrounding the exchange, the emotional relationship between grandfather and grandchildren might reopen negotiations that Highgrove had seemingly closed. Or perhaps palace officials would interpret any such maneuver completely differently, as an attempt to circumvent boundaries that had literally just been established. And imagine the alarm bells if word of something like that reached the people around Charles. From their perspective, the entire purpose of Highgrove's alleged restrictions reasons had been to prevent ambiguity. Meghan and Harry had been given private family access, but that access supposedly came without photographs, without a restored public royal role, and without permission to transform proximity to Charles into some giant international branding moment. If an unofficial message suddenly appeared afterward asking for another private conversation, another opportunity, another route to the king, palace advisors could immediately wonder whether Highgrove had been misunderstood or deliberately ignored. That is where Tom Bower's broader portrayal of the Sussex relationship with the palace makes this imagined development so explosive. The issue would no longer simply be whether Meghan wanted reconciliation. Almost everyone can understand wanting reconciliation with family. The issue would be whether she was willing to accept the conditions under which reconciliation was being offered. And those are radically different questions. Highgrove supposedly represented controlled access. Going around officials would represent resistance to that control. So suddenly the infamous 47 minutes would look less like the ending of the story and more like the moment that triggered an entirely new battle behind closed doors. Meghan had allegedly entered Highgrove hoping the presence of Archie and Lilibet might soften Charles, walked away without the public royal reset critics believed she wanted, and then faced the brutal reality that the machinery surrounding the monarchy remained firmly in place. If the front door was guarded by protocol, would she simply accept defeat or start looking for another door? That possibility becomes even more explosive when Prince Harry is placed back into the picture, because the original narrative already describes a relationship in which access, security, and royal recognition had become deeply tangled together. Prince William and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, were portrayed as having little appetite for any arrangement that could blur the Sussexes' position again, while Harry and Meghan were depicted as leaving Highgrove without the visible breakthrough critics believed they wanted. No photograph emerged. No restored Buckingham Palace accommodation emerged. No announcement suddenly suggested that official duties were returning. Instead, Harry remained connected to his Invictus Games commitments, while Meghan reportedly departed with the children, leaving behind an extraordinary vacuum in which silence itself became the story. And in royal politics, silence can sometimes be more brutal than rejection, because rejection gives you something to fight against, while silence gives you absolutely nothing. That is why the speculative idea of bypassing officials carries such dramatic weight. It suggests not a grand confrontation, but something potentially much more revealing, an unwillingness to allow Highgrove to be the final word. Perhaps an intermediary could carry a private appeal. Perhaps another family connection could quietly communicate that Meghan wanted King Charles to reconsider. Perhaps the argument could be framed around Archie and Leotid rather than titles, photographs, or official status. But there is no verified evidence establishing that any of those specific approaches actually occurred, and that distinction matters enormously. What the original account does establish as its own narrative is the atmosphere from which this speculation grows: strict ground rules, extraordinary caution, and a royal household determined to keep family contact separate from institutional privilege. And if officials believed somebody was attempting to test those boundaries, the response would hardly need to be dramatic. There would be no shouting match, no furious public statement, no palace official racing toward television cameras. The monarchy's most effective weapon has always been something quieter. Nothing. No response. No confirmation. No additional access. No photograph. No public acknowledgement that another approach had even been attempted. That would leave Meghan facing exactly the problem the Highgrove encounter supposedly created in the first place. The ability to communicate privately might still exist, but the ability to transform that communication into restored royal standing remained completely outside her control. That is ultimately what makes this continuation of Tom Bower's narrative so intriguing. Queen Camilla could witness what happened inside the room. Prince William could remain protective of the institution's future. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, could remain outside the drama, and King Charles could preserve a narrow personal relationship without surrendering a single inch of constitutional or public ground. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan would be forced to confront the possibility that access to family no longer meant access to monarchy. And perhaps that is the real sting hidden beneath all this gossip. The biggest failure would not be that a secret route to King Charles was supposedly attempted and blocked. It would be discovering that bypassing the gatekeepers changed absolutely nothing, because the boundaries may not have belonged to the gatekeepers in the first place. They may have belonged to the king himself. If that was the lesson Highgrove was designed to deliver, then no private intermediary, emotional appeal, or carefully delivered message could erase it. The door to family contact might remain slightly open, but the door back into royal life could remain firmly closed, and after everything that happened during those intensely scrutinized minutes, that distinction may be the one reality Harry and Meghan can no longer escape.